Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back to ancient Greece. Not to the philosophical academies of Athens or the bustling markets of Corinth, but to a city-state renowned for its brutal discipline and unyielding focus on military might, Sparta. We're going to peel back the layers of legend and delve into the truly harsh reality of what it was like to be a Spartan child. Imagine yourself, a tiny infant, subjected to an immediate, chilling judgment, or a young boy torn from his family to begin a life of relentless training and deprivation. Sounds like a tough upbringing, doesn't it? The myths of Spartan strength are impressive, but here's the cheeky reality check if you were a Spartan child. You probably wouldn't survive this, at least. Not with a soft heart, a full stomach, or a concept of individual freedom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the very moment you entered the world in ancient Sparta, your life was not your own. It belonged to the state. This chilling reality began with the newborn examination and fate initial judgment decided life or death. Forget the loving embrace of parents. Your very existence was subject to a ruthless, pragmatic assessment by the elders of Sparta. Imagine being born, instead of being swaddled and admired. You, the newborn infant, would be taken by your father to a council of elders, the Gerousia. This was not a quick glance, it was a meticulous examination. They would scrutinize your physical form, looking for any sign of weakness, deformity, or imperfection. Were your limbs straight? Was your breathing strong? Did you appear robust and healthy? This wasn't about a child's potential for happiness or intellectual development. It was solely about your potential as a future warrior or a fit mother of warriors. It's like a prenatal fitness test, but performed at birth, with lethal consequences for failure. If you were deemed healthy and strong, a potentially valuable asset to the Spartan state, you were permitted to live. You would be returned to your family for a brief period of early nurturing, typically until the age of 7. But if the elders found you to be sickly, weak, or physically deformed in any way, your fate was sealed. You were considered a burden, an unproductive mouth to feed, and a potential weakness to the formidable Spartan war machine. The grim outcome for these unfit infants was often abandonment. You would be taken to a chasm near Mount Taygetus, a place known as the Apothete, or place of rejection, and left to die from exposure. This wasn't an act of cruelty in the Spartan mindset. It was a pragmatic decision for the collective good of the state. Spartan society valued strength, utility, and the collective above all else, and a weak link could not be tolerated. Imagine your first few hours of life culminating in a cold, lonely death, deemed unworthy before you even took your first true breath. This ruthless selection process served a chilling purpose to ensure that only the strongest and healthiest individuals contributed to the Spartan population, maintaining the physical prowess of their military. It was eugenics in its most brutal form, an early unromanticized version of survival of the fittest applied to human infants. One mainstream historical fact that supports the historical accounts of this practice is the writings of ancient Greek historians like Plutarch, who explicitly detailed the inspection of Spartan newborns by the elders at the Lesh, a public portico, and the subsequent abandonment of ill-formed or puny children at the Apothete. While archaeological evidence for large piles of infant bones at Mount Taygetus is debated, some bones found belong to adults or older children. The textual evidence remains a powerful testament to the custom. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, recounted by some ancient authors, suggests that Spartan mothers would sometimes bathe their infants in wine, believing that healthy babies would react well while weaker ones would be distressed, thus serving as an early, crude test of vitality before the elder's official inspection. Imagine your first bath being a wine bath, just to prove you're robust enough to live. It's a truly bizarre, yet telling, detail. Historians still argue whether the practice of infant exposure was as widespread and systematic as ancient accounts suggest, or if it was a more sporadic occurrence for truly deformed infants, with the severity exaggerated to emphasize Spartan harshness. Was it universal, or an extreme rarity regardless? Your very first moments of life in Sparta were a terrifying gamble, with your survival depending entirely on the unforgiving judgment of the state. So, you survived the brutal newborn examination, a small victory in a life destined for hardship. But even your early childhood ages, 0 and 7 Spartan nurturing, tough beginnings wasn't the gentle, carefree period of play and familial warmth we might associate with growing up. Instead, it was a carefully managed phase designed to instill resilience, obedience, and an early detachment from individual comfort, setting the stage for the rigorous training that lay ahead. Imagine your first 7 years. You would remain with your family, primarily under the care of your mother and female relatives. However, unlike other Greek city-states where children were often coddled, Spartan mothers were renowned for their austere, almost cold, approach to childcare. They were celebrated for not indulging their infants with unnecessary comforts. You wouldn't be swaddled tightly to restrict your movement. Instead, you'd be left relatively free, encouraged to develop strength. Imagine a baby who is deliberately not spoiled, not comforted on demand, but allowed to cry it out. It's like a very early, very intense form of tough love parenting, but dictated by the state. Crying was discouraged. Fear of the dark or of loneliness was not tolerated. You would be taught from your earliest days to endure discomfort, to be unafraid of solitude, and to suppress emotional displays. Spartan mothers were famously stoic, and they expected their children to be the same. The goal was to forge a child who was fearless, self-reliant, and unaccustomed to physical ease, while you had your mother's presence. The focus wasn't on individual bonding in the modern sense. Your family's role was to prepare you for your ultimate purpose service to the state, your games and activities. Even at this young age, would subtly reinforce physical prowess and a competitive spirit. You might be encouraged to participate in rough-and-tumble play, testing your limits and building rudimentary physical endurance. Food, even in these early years, would be sufficient but not indulgent. You wouldn't be given many sweets or delicacies. Your diet would be plain and wholesome, focused on nourishment rather than pleasure. This early conditioning to a simple diet would prepare you for the far more meager rations of the agoge. The stories and songs you heard wouldn't be fairy tales about princes and princesses, but tales of Spartan heroes, of bravery in battle, and of unwavering loyalty to the state. Your early understanding of the world would be saturated with the values of military excellence, self-sacrifice, and collective identity. One mainstream historical fact that supports this early, rigorous nurturing is the accounts from various ancient Greek writers, particularly Plutarch, who described Spartan mothers as having common nurses who were known for their strict upbringing, not spoiling children, and encouraging self-reliance, even teaching them to eat whatever was put before them without fuss. This common knowledge among other Greeks suggests it was a well-known Spartan trait. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that Spartan mothers were said to breastfeed their own children for a surprisingly long time. sometimes up to 4 or 5 years, potentially to ensure optimal early nutrition and to strengthen the child for the rigors to come. Before solid foods became the primary source of calories, imagine being a toddler and still breastfeeding, a testament to their focus on fundamental physical development. Historians still argue whether this early childhood tough love primarily fostered genuinely resilient and fearless individuals, or if it led to suppressed emotional development and a rigid psychological profile that made Spartans exceptional warriors, but perhaps less adaptable in other aspects of life. Did it make them stronger, or just emotionally numb regardless? Your first 7 years in Sparta, seemingly a period of innocent childhood, were actually a carefully engineered prelude, designed to harden your body and mind for the uncompromising system that awaited you. So, your first 7 years were a tough, emotional proving ground, a prelude to the relentless system that defined Spartan boyhood. At the tender age of 7, your personal life ended, and your state-controlled existence truly began. With the agoge leaving home, entering state system, this was the moment you were ripped from the relative comfort of your family and plunged into a brutal, lifelong military training program, designed to forge you into an unyielding Spartan warrior. Imagine that day. You, a small child of 7, would be taken from your home. There would be no tearful goodbyes from your mother, at least not openly. Spartan mothers were expected to be stoic, even on this emotional day. You wouldn't be going to a new school with colorful classrooms. You'd be entering a harsh, communal barracks, a world of boys your own age and older, all subjected to the same rigorous discipline. It's like being sent to the most intense military boarding school imaginable. But you're 7, and there's no summer break. Ever. From that moment on, you would live in communal messes, or syssitia. With your age mates, your family was replaced by your agel, a herd or flock, a unit of boys of the same age. Under the direct supervision of older youths and state-appointed overseers, your individuality was systematically stripped away. You would wear minimal clothing, sleep on hard reed beds, and be expected to endure hunger, cold, and physical discomfort without complaint. The purpose of the agoge was not just physical training, it was a comprehensive re-education. You were taught absolute obedience, unwavering loyalty to the state above all else, and the importance of the collective over the individual. Your new family was Sparta itself, and your new parents were the stern, often brutal, instructors who shaped every aspect of your existence. This removal from the family unit was deliberate. It prevented the formation of strong familial bonds that might compete with loyalty to the state. It ensured that all Spartan boys received the exact same, standardized, brutal upbringing, creating a homogeneous fighting force. There was no room for deviation, no special treatment, and no escape. Your days would be rigidly structured, from dawn to dusk, filled with exercises, drills, and lessons in discipline. Your every move, every word, would be scrutinized. Any sign of weakness, disobedience, or softness would be met with swift and harsh punishment. The agoge was a constant crucible, heating and hammering you into the desired shape of a Spartan citizen soldier. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the state's absolute control over children is that Plutarch, in his Life of Lycurgus, the legendary Spartan lawgiver, explicitly states that Lycurgus ordained that children were not to be reared by their parents as they pleased, but were to be taken by the state at age 7. This legal decree, whether historically accurate in its origins or a later idealization, reflects the core principle of state ownership of Spartan youth. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that when boys were first taken into the agoge, their heads were shaved, a symbolic act of severing ties with their pampered past and marking their initiation into a life of austerity and communal living. Imagine your initiation into military school involving a really bad haircut. It's a small, dehumanizing detail in a life of controlled hardship. Historians still argue whether the Agogji, despite its brutality, primarily produced exceptionally effective soldiers due to its rigorous training, or if its psychological tolls and narrow focus on warfare ultimately hindered Spartan society's broader intellectual and artistic development. Did it make them supreme warriors, or just one-dimensional automatons regardless? The day you entered the Agogj was the day your personal life ended, and your relentless, state-controlled transformation into a weapon of Sparta truly began. So, at 7 years old, your life became a relentless, state-controlled machine, and the engine driving that machine was a constant, grueling regimen of training physical hardship, constant discipline. Forget organized sports teams or comfortable gyms. Your daily existence in the Agoge was a brutal, unceasing program designed to push your body to its absolute limits, break your spirit of individuality, and forge you into an unyielding instrument of the Spartan army. Imagine your typical day. You would wake before dawn, often to the shouts of your instructors, in the communal barracks. With no privacy or personal space, your body would ache perpetually from the previous day's exertions. From that moment until dusk, your time would be filled with an unrelenting series of physical drills. You would run, jump, wrestle, throw javelins, and practice unarmed combat. These weren't just exercises, they were tests of endurance and pain tolerance. It's like being in a permanent, high-intensity boot camp, but for children. And the drill sergeants never go home. You would train barefoot, year-round, on rough terrain, intentionally hardening your feet to withstand long marches and harsh ground. Imagine the constant blisters, cuts, and calluses. Your clothing was minimal a single. Thin cloak, the triban that you wore in all seasons, summer and winter. This was deliberate, intended to accustom you to cold and discomfort, building your resilience to the elements. You learned to endure the biting wind and the frigid nights without complaint. Beyond the physical drills, constant discipline was enforced with an iron fist. Obedience was absolute. Questioning authority was unthinkable. Any deviation from the rigid rules, any sign of weakness or insubordination, was met with swift and often brutal corporal punishment from older boys, instructors, or the pedonymus, the overseer of the Agogji. You learned to suppress pain, to hide your emotions, and to endure silently. Public floggings were common, not just as punishment, but as a test of endurance and a display of stoicism. You would be taught simple, direct speech, known as laconic speech, avoiding unnecessary words or elaborate rhetoric. This focus on brevity extended to all aspects of your life. There was no time for idle chatter, no room for individual expression. Your words, like your actions, were to be precise and purposeful, reflecting the Spartan ideal of efficiency. The goal of this relentless training was to create not just a soldier, but a citizen completely loyal to Sparta, physically hardened, emotionally detached, and utterly disciplined. Every exercise, every punishment, every deprivation was meticulously designed to strip away your individual identity and replace it with an unwavering devotion to the collective. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the intensity of this training is the annual flogging ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia. While debated as a rite of passage versus a purely punitive act, boys would endure severe public whipping, often to the point of collapse or death. demonstrating their ability to withstand pain without crying out. This extreme practice highlights the cultural emphasis on endurance and emotional suppression, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, recounted by Plutarch, tells of a Spartan boy who, having stolen a fox and hidden it under his cloak to avoid detection, allowed the fox to gnaw out his entrails rather than reveal the theft and betray his training. Imagine letting a wild animal literally eat you from the inside out to avoid punishment, while likely exaggerated. This story powerfully illustrates the extreme lengths to which Spartan boys were taught to endure pain and discipline. Historians still argue whether the extreme physical and psychological demands of the agoge primarily created an unparalleled fighting force that secured Sparta's military dominance, or if it led to a society that was ultimately rigid, resistant to change, and lacking in intellectual and artistic innovation. Did it make them supreme? Or just supremely narrow-minded regardless? Your childhood in Sparta was a continuous, brutal test, designed to mold your body and mind into a single-minded instrument of war, pushing you beyond what most people consider the limits of human endurance. So, your childhood was a continuous, brutal test of endurance and discipline. But beyond the physical training, a more insidious form of conditioning targeted your most basic human need, leading to scarcity and hunger, deliberate deprivation, stealing for survival. Forget regular, nutritious meals. Spartan boys were intentionally kept on meager rations, forced to forage and steal, not out of necessity, but as a deliberate part of their training to foster cunning, self-reliance, and resourcefulness. Imagine your stomach perpetually grumbling. Food in the agoge was deliberately insufficient. You would be given just enough to survive, but rarely enough to feel truly satisfied. This wasn't accidental. It was a calculated policy designed to harden your body and mind, making you accustomed to hunger and teaching you to cope with deprivation, a crucial skill for future military campaigns. It's like being on the world's strictest, longest-running diet plan, where the goal isn't weight loss, but emotional suppression and extreme resourcefulness. This deliberate scarcity led directly to the encouragement of stealing for survival. Boys were expected to supplement their meager rations by stealing food, often from farms, gardens, or even other Spartan citizens. The catch: if you were caught, the punishment was severe, not for the act of stealing itself, but for your clumsiness, your lack of cunning, and your failure to avoid detection. Imagine being flogged not for stealing an apple, but for dropping it and getting caught. It's a very specific kind of brutal logic. This emphasis on stealth and cunning was a vital part of their military training. A Spartan warrior needed to be able to forage behind enemy lines, to move undetected, and to acquire supplies without being discovered. The agoge instilled these skills from a young age, turning every meal into a strategic mission. You learned to observe, to plan, to execute, and to escape, all driven by the primal urge to feed your hungry stomach. The types of food you would steal were often simple fruits, vegetables, or perhaps small animals if you were particularly adept at hunting or trapping. Any food you acquired, legitimately or otherwise, would be consumed quickly and often raw or barely cooked. To avoid detection, this constant hunger also taught you self-control. You learned to endure the pangs of an empty stomach, to suppress the urge to complain, and to focus on the task at hand despite physical discomfort. It contributed to the Spartan ideal of stoicism. Where personal needs were subjugated to the demands of the state, one mainstream historical fact that famously exemplifies this practice is the story of the Spartan boy and the fox, which we touched upon earlier. While it highlights the extreme endurance taught in the agoge, letting the fox gnaw his entrails rather than being caught for stealing, it also directly points to the institutionalized practice of stealing to supplement rations and the severe punishment for being caught. Not for the theft itself. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some ancient sources suggest that the best thieves in the agoge were sometimes rewarded or praised, further cementing the idea that cunning and successful stealth were highly valued traits, even when applied to breaking typical social norms. Imagine winning an award for being the best petty criminal. It's a strange honor system. Historians still argue whether the practice of deliberate food deprivation primarily contributed to the Spartans' famed physical toughness and cunning, or if it led to chronic malnutrition and stunted growth among the agoge recruits, potentially hindering their overall physical development in the long run. Did it make them stronger, or just perpetually hungry regardless? Your childhood in Sparta was a constant negotiation with an empty stomach, a relentless training in stealth and endurance where every meal was a hard-won victory in a silent, lifelong battle against hunger. So, your childhood was a constant battle against hunger, honing your stealth and resilience. But while physical prowess and cunning were paramount, the world of intellectual pursuits was largely ignored, leading to education and literacy minimal learning. Focus on obedience. Forget the philosophical debates of Athens or the pursuit of academic knowledge. Your Spartan education was almost entirely practical, designed to serve the state's military needs, leaving little room for reading, writing, or critical thought. Imagine your classroom. It wasn't a quiet room with scrolls and tablets. Your lessons took place in the dusty training grounds, the wrestling pits, and the communal barracks. Your instructors, the paidonomos and older youths, weren't teaching you poetry or mathematics. They were teaching you how to fight, how to obey, and how to survive. It's like being enrolled in a very exclusive, very brutal vocational school, where the only vocation is war. Literacy, while not entirely absent, was considered secondary, almost superfluous. For the average Spartan boy, you might learn the absolute basics of reading and writing, enough to read a military order or perhaps a simple inscription. But there was no emphasis on extensive literature, history, or philosophy. Why? Because these were seen as potentially distracting from your primary duty service to Sparta. Critical thinking and independent thought were actively discouraged, as they could lead to questioning the rigid Spartan system. Instead, your education focused on physical prowess, relentless drills, wrestling, running, and weapon training, obedience and discipline, instant, unquestioning adherence to commands, reinforced through constant punishment, martial music and dance, not for artistic expression, but for coordination, rhythm, and instilling martial spirit in formation, laconic speech as we discussed, precise, brief communication, stripping away unnecessary words. This was a form of mental discipline, training you to be direct and to the point. Moral and ethical instruction, Spartan-style stories of Spartan heroes, emphasis on courage, sacrifice for the state, and contempt for weakness. The goal was to produce a citizen soldier who was physically formidable, absolutely obedient, and mentally focused solely on the collective good of Sparta. There was no need for a philosopher on the battlefield, or a poet to defend the city walls. Your mind was to be as disciplined and sharp as your spear, but only in ways that served military objectives. This deliberate suppression of broader intellectual pursuits is a stark contrast to other Greek city-states, particularly Athens, which valued rhetoric, philosophy, and the arts. Spartan education was singularly focused, a narrow path to a singular purpose. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this minimal focus on traditional learning is that ancient sources, such as Xenophon's Constitution of the Spartans, describe how Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, decreed that Spartan education should focus on discipline and military training rather than academic subjects. This emphasis on practical, martial skills over intellectual development was a defining characteristic of the agoge. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that while formal reading was minimal, Spartan boys were often taught to sing martial songs and recite poetry that celebrated Spartan values and heroic deeds, serving as a powerful form of oral tradition and cultural indoctrination rather than literary study. Imagine your history class being solely composed of yelling epic poems about battles. It's a way of teaching history, but with significantly more shouting. Historians still argue whether this narrow educational focus primarily contributed to Sparta's unparalleled military effectiveness and social stability, or if it ultimately led to a cultural stagnation that contributed to its long-term decline in influence compared to more intellectually vibrant city-states. Did it make them strong, or just inflexible regardless? Your mind as a Spartan child was a carefully controlled landscape, pruned of any unnecessary intellectual growth, designed only to grow the unyielding branches of obedience and martial skill. So, your mind was rigidly pruned for military efficiency, with little room for intellectual flourishing, and just as your mind was hardened, your body was kept in a state of perpetual discomfort, bringing us to the reality of clothing and shelter bare minimum, exposure to elements, forget cozy beds, warm clothes, or privacy. Your living conditions in the agoge were intentionally Spartan, pun intended, designed to accustom you to hardship and strip away any desire for personal comfort. Imagine your wardrobe. From the age of 7, upon entering the agoge, you would be given a single, thin cloak called a triban. This was your primary garment, and you were expected to wear it year-round, in all seasons, whether it was the scorching heat of summer or the biting cold of winter. There were no seasonal changes of clothes, no extra layers for warmth. Imagine waking up on a frosty morning with only a thin piece of wool between you and the frigid air. Expected to train for hours. It's like a permanent outdoor adventure camp. But the dress code is barely anything, and the weather is never on your side. This minimal clothing was a deliberate strategy to harden your body. You learned to endure cold without shivering, to withstand the sun without complaint, and to acclimatize your body to extremes. Any longing for warmth or softness was considered a weakness to be purged. Your shelter was equally austere. You would sleep in communal barracks, on beds that were far from comfortable. These were typically made from reeds, gathered from the Eurotas River, which you had to prepare yourself, stripping them bare by hand without a knife. Imagine sleeping on a hard, unyielding surface, often without blankets, sharing a cramped space with dozens of other boys. There was no privacy, no personal space to retreat to. Reinforcing the communal and collective nature of Spartan life, the concept of a home as a place of comfort and retreat simply didn't exist for you in the agoge. Your home was the barracks, a functional space designed for training and communal living. Not for relaxation or individual solace, you learn to sleep quickly, deeply, and under any conditions. A crucial skill for a future soldier on campaign. Cleanliness, by modern standards, was also minimal. Bathing was infrequent, and often done in cold water, further hardening the body. Personal hygiene took a backseat to military readiness and endurance. You were expected to be tough, and that meant embracing a certain level of grime and discomfort. This constant exposure to the elements and denial of comfort instilled a deep-seated stoicism. You learned that physical discomfort was simply a part of life, to be endured without complaint. It erased any lingering desire for luxury or softness, preparing you for the privations of military campaigns and a life dedicated to the state. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this austere living is that ancient sources, like Xenophon and Plutarch, consistently describe the Spartan boys wearing only a single tribon throughout the year and sleeping on reed beds. This detail is a recurring motif in accounts of Spartan education, underscoring its historical accuracy as a core element of the agog, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit. Described by Plutarch, states that boys in the agoge were sometimes forbidden from even wearing sandals, so that their feet would become hardened by walking barefoot on rough terrain and develop a natural resistance to injury. Imagine going through your entire childhood and adolescence with constantly bruised and calloused bare feet. It's a very literal interpretation of toughing it out. Historians still argue whether this extreme deprivation of comfort primarily created incredibly hardy and adaptable soldiers, or if it led to unnecessary suffering and a higher incidence of illness or injury that might have been avoided with more practical provisions. Did it make them resilient, or just miserable regardless? Your childhood in Sparta was a continuous lesson in discomfort, forcing your body to adapt to the bare minimum, forging a physical and mental toughness born from constant exposure to the elements. So, your body was accustomed to the bare minimum, hardened by constant exposure and discomfort. But beyond the elements, the agoge employed another relentless tool for forging discipline: corporal punishment, brutal discipline, encouraged endurance. Forget timeouts or gentle reprimands. Your Spartan childhood was punctuated by frequent, severe beatings and public floggings, administered not just as punishment, but as a deliberate means to test and instill unwavering obedience and an almost superhuman tolerance for pain. Imagine the ever-present threat of the whip, disobedience, sloppiness, a show of weakness, or even a perceived lack of effort during training. Any infraction could result in immediate and brutal physical retribution. Your instructors, the older youths, and especially the pedonymus, the overseer of the agoge, wielded absolute authority, and their method of choice was often the whip or a stick. It's like living in a reality show where the challenge is to avoid being hit, and failure means immediate, painful consequences. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about encouraged endurance. You were expected to bear the pain silently, without crying out, flinching, or showing any sign of weakness. To do so would bring even greater shame and further punishment. These beatings were tests, designed to break down your individual will and replace it with an unyielding stoicism and a profound capacity for suffering. Imagine being whipped repeatedly, your back stinging, your muscles tensing, but forcing your face to remain impassive, your lips sealed shut. The most famous, and perhaps most terrifying, example of this was the ritual flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Each year, boys would be publicly scourged, enduring repeated lashings, often until they collapsed or, in extreme cases, died. This was not merely punitive. It was a deeply ingrained rite of passage, a public display of fortitude and obedience. The boys who endured the most without crying out were celebrated and honored. It's a very extreme way to earn a gold star, with literally life or death stakes. This constant exposure to physical pain, and the expectation of enduring it silently, fundamentally shaped your psyche. You learned to dissociate from discomfort, to push past your body's natural protests, and to internalize the idea that pain was merely a sensation to be overcome through sheer willpower. This created warriors who were terrifyingly effective on the battlefield, capable of fighting on even with grievous wounds. The brutality was often administered by older Irenes Agoge graduates, who served as instructors or even by the Paidonimus himself. Reinforcing the hierarchy and the absolute power of the state's representatives over your young life, one mainstream historical fact that chillingly supports the widespread use of corporal punishment is the archaeological evidence and ancient literary accounts, e.g., by Plutarch and Xenophon, detailing the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia and the diamastigosis flogging ritual performed there, the remains of the altar, often blood-stained. And the consistent ancient testimony confirmed the historical reality of this brutal practice as a central element of Spartan youth training. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that the diamastigosis was sometimes accompanied by the stealing of cheeses placed on the altar, a distractionary element that added another layer of cunning and physical challenge to the already brutal flogging, testing their ability to endure pain while performing another task. Imagine trying to grab cheese while someone is whipping you. It's multitasking. But with extreme pain, historians still argue whether the extreme corporal punishment in the Agoge primarily instilled unbreakable discipline and pain tolerance, directly contributing to Spartan military success, or if it also led to psychological trauma and suppressed individual initiative that ultimately contributed to Sparta's later decline in innovation. Did it make them stronger? Or just more broken regardless? Your body in the Agoge was a canvas for pain, constantly tested and beaten into submission, all in the name of creating an unyielding instrument for the Spartan state. So, your body was a canvas for pain, constantly beaten into submission. But the brutality wasn't always top-down. The Agoge deliberately fostered a harsh internal environment, leading to peer rivalry and bullying fostered competition, brutal bonds. Forget supportive friendships. Your relationships with your age mates were forged in a crucible of constant competition, often escalating into physical confrontations, all designed to identify the strongest and build unshakable, yet brutal, loyalty within your agel. Imagine your interactions with the boys around you. From the moment you entered the barracks, you were encouraged to compete against each other, not just in drills, but in every aspect of daily life. Who could endure the most hunger? Who could withstand the cold with the least complaint? Who could steal food most cunningly without getting caught? This constant, direct comparison fueled a fierce, often aggressive, rivalry among you. It's like a permanent, unspoken, and surprisingly violent popularity contest, where popularity means being the toughest. This rivalry frequently spilled over into physical conflict. Older boys were often permitted, and even encouraged, to test younger ones through physical challenges or even outright bullying. You might be challenged to a wrestling match, or simply pushed to your limits by an older, stronger boy. Fighting among the boys was not discouraged. It was often seen as a necessary part of the training, teaching you how to defend yourself, how to assert dominance, and how to operate within a hierarchy established by brute force. Imagine getting into a fistfight with your bunkmate, and the instructors are just watching, taking notes. While brutal, these interactions also forged incredibly strong, if complex bonds. You and your agel were a unit. You trained together, suffered together, and often faced punishment together. The boys you competed against were also the ones you relied on. This created a paradoxical sense of loyalty. You might fight tooth and nail with your peers, but you would defend them fiercely against outsiders or rival groups within the Agoge. This fierce internal competition was meant to sharpen you all, ensuring that only the most resilient and capable would rise. The goal was not to create individuals who liked each other, but individuals who were utterly dependable in combat. You learned to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your comrades through direct, often painful, experience. This understanding, born of shared hardship and fierce competition, translated directly to the disciplined cohesion of the Spartan phalanx. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this fostered competition is the system of Irenes' older boys, aged 18 to 19, being placed in charge of younger age-alay groups of boys. These Irenes had the authority to issue commands, discipline, and even instigate fights among the younger boys to test their courage and obedience. This hierarchical structure within the agoge actively promoted a system of challenge and control among peers. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that Irenes were sometimes given the right to demand services from younger boys, like fetching food, and if a younger boy failed, the Irenes were expected to punish them, thus creating a constant, low-level power dynamic and reinforcing a culture of immediate obedience within the ranks. Imagine your older mentor making you do their chores, and then beating you if you didn't do them perfectly. It's a very practical form of mentorship. Historians still argue whether the fostering of intense peer rivalry and bullying in the agoge primarily created highly effective, cohesive military units by filtering out weakness, or if it led to widespread psychological trauma and resentment among the less dominant boys, potentially undermining their long-term well-being. Did it forge unbreakable bonds, or just deep-seated emotional scars regardless? Your relationships in the agoge were a complex web of competition and forced solidarity, teaching you to fight both with and against your closest companions, all in the service of Sparta's unyielding military ideal. So, your peer relationships were a brutal crucible of competition and forced solidarity, but the state's control and the Spartan boys' training extended to an even darker, more terrifying practice, bringing us to the chilling reality of the Crypteia secret police, brutal helot control. This wasn't just a part of your training, it was a deadly, clandestine rite of passage, a final, horrifying test designed to harden your heart, hone your stealth, and maintain the ruthless subjugation of Sparta's enslaved population. Imagine reaching the age of about 18 or 19. You've endured years of the agoge, proving your physical prowess and unwavering obedience. Now, you would be selected for the Crypteia, a secret, elite police force operating in the shadows. You wouldn't wear armor or carry a typical soldier's arms. Instead, you'd be given a dagger and sent out into the Spartan countryside, particularly into areas inhabited by the helots. It's like being recruited into a secret police force. But your primary mission is terror, and your targets are unarmed. The helots were the enslaved population of Laconia and Messenia, bound to the land and vastly outnumbering the Spartans. They were the backbone of Sparta's economy, but also a constant, simmering threat of rebellion. The Crypteia was designed to keep them in a state of perpetual fear and submission. Your mission, as a member of the Crypteia, would be to survive in the wilderness, foraging for your own food, further honing your stealth skills from earlier deprivation, but your primary, gruesome task was to terrorize and kill any helots who appeared too strong, too rebellious, or too influential. You would lie in wait, hidden by day, and by night. You would ambush and murder unsuspecting helots. This was not open warfare, it was clandestine, psychological warfare, aimed at decapitating potential uprisings before they could even begin. This was the ultimate test of your Spartan education. It honed your stealth and cunning to a deadly degree. It forced you to kill in cold blood, without the adrenaline of open battle. It cemented your loyalty to the state by making you an active participant in its most brutal form of control. And, crucially, it completely desensitized you to the humanity of the Helots, turning them into targets rather than people. Imagine silently stalking someone, then ending their life, all as part of your final graduation into Spartan adulthood. The existence of the Crypteia highlights the fundamental tension within Spartan society. Their elite military prowess was built upon the backs of an enormous enslaved population, and maintaining that system required extreme, institutionalized violence. It was a terrifying tool of social control, and participation in it marked you as a fully indoctrinated instrument of the state. One mainstream historical fact that chillingly supports the existence and purpose of the Crypteia is the description by ancient Greek writers like Thucydides and Plutarch. Thucydides, for example, recounts an incident where 2,000 Helots who had been promised freedom for their service were instead secretly murdered by the Spartans. A deed of darkest secrecy, strongly implicating practices like the Crypteia, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, described by some historians, suggests that members of the Crypteia would sometimes deliberately live in disguise among the Helots for extended periods, gathering intelligence before striking, adding another layer of insidious deception to their brutal mission. Imagine living a double life for months, pretending to be one of the enslaved, only to then turn on them. It's a truly chilling form of espionage and terror. Historians still argue whether the Crypteia was a continuous, institutionalized secret police unit, or if it was a more sporadic, desperate measure employed during times of heightened Helot unrest, with its brutality perhaps exaggerated by ancient Athenian sources hostile to Sparta. Was it a permanent feature, or an intermittent response to rebellion? Regardless, your involvement in the Crypteia was the brutal capstone of your Spartan education, irrevocably staining your hands and soul with the violence necessary to uphold the very foundations of your society. So, your brutal involvement in the Crypteia solidified your role as an instrument of the state, defining the apex of Spartan male education. But what about the other half of the population? Let's turn to girls' education and training physicality for motherhood. Less rigorous, while not subjected to the agoge in the same brutal way as boys, Spartan girls and young women still underwent a unique, rigorous system of physical training, entirely focused on their vital role in producing healthy, strong warriors for the state. Imagine your life as a Spartan girl. You wouldn't be confined to the domestic sphere, learning only household chores and weaving, as was common for girls in other Greek city-states like Athens. Instead, you would participate in a structured program of physical exercise from a young age. You would run, wrestle, throw discus and javelin, and practice various forms of gymnastics. It's like a girls-only Junior Olympics, but the ultimate prize is giving birth to a strong son. This physical training was not for warfare. Women did not fight in the Spartan army, but for eugenic purposes. The Spartans believed that strong, physically fit mothers would produce stronger, healthier offspring, thus ensuring the continued vitality of their warrior class. Your body was viewed as a vessel for the state, and its fitness was paramount. Imagine a society where your primary patriotic duty is to be physically robust enough to have healthy babies. While rigorous, the girls' training was generally considered less rigorous than that of the boys. It didn't involve the same level of deliberate deprivation, systematic hunger, or public corporal punishment. You would also remain within your family home, not living in communal barracks. However, you were still exposed to the same Spartan values of discipline, self-control, and loyalty to the state. Modesty, by other Greek standards, was also less emphasized, with girls sometimes exercising in short tunics or even nude, a practice that shocked other Greeks but was seen as natural and practical in Sparta. Your education also included music, dance, and poetry, often with a focus on choral performances that celebrated Spartan virtues and heroes. This was distinct from the boys' almost purely military education, though these artistic pursuits still served to reinforce communal values rather than individual expression. You might learn to read and write, potentially to a higher degree than the boys. As there was less emphasis on purely martial skills, marriage for Spartan girls typically occurred later than in other Greek states, often in your late teens or early 20s, emphasizing physical maturity and readiness for childbirth. Spartan women also held unique property rights, being able to inherit and own land, reflecting their crucial role in managing family estates while the men were constantly engaged in military training or war. This economic independence contributed to their famed assertiveness. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this unique education is the accounts from ancient historians like Xenophon and Plutarch, who both describe Spartan girls as undergoing public athletic training and exercises, contrasting sharply with the domestic confinement of women in most other Greek city-states. This physical education was explicitly linked to the production of strong children. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that Spartan girls and young women were sometimes said to participate in public festivals and processions dressed in revealing tunics, or even nude, a practice that scandalized other Greeks but was viewed in Sparta as a natural and even healthy way to promote physical fitness and confidence. Imagine other city-states gossiping about your workout attire because it's too revealing. It's a stark cultural difference. Historians still argue whether the relatively more public and physically active role of Spartan women primarily contributed to their greater societal influence and property rights compared to other Greek women, or if their entire education was still ultimately a subservient role. Solely defined by their reproductive function for the state, did they have more agency, or just a different kind of servitude regardless? Your life as a Spartan girl was a unique blend of physical conditioning and civic duty, preparing you not for the battlefield, but for the equally vital task of perpetuating the very strength of Sparta through robust motherhood. So, your life as a Spartan girl was a unique blend of physical conditioning and civic duty, aimed at perpetuating the state's strength, but for both boys and girls in the Agogge, and, indeed, for Spartan society as a whole. Every aspect of life was overseen by an unforgiving authority figure, bringing us to the crucial role of the pedonymous overseer, judge, punisher. This state-appointed official was the absolute master of the Agogge, wielding immense power to shape, control, and brutally discipline every Spartan youth. Imagine this figure. The pedonymous wasn't just a teacher or a headmaster. He was the embodiment of the state's will over its children, appointed by the kings. He held supreme authority over the boys in the Agogge. From the moment they entered at 7 until they completed their training in early adulthood, his word was law, and his decisions were final. It's like having a principal who is also a Supreme Court judge, a drill sergeant, and a professional disciplinarian, all rolled into one terrifying package. His responsibilities were vast and absolute. Overseer the pedonymous was responsible for the entire Agogge system. He ensured that the strict laws and customs of Lycurgus were followed to the letter. He monitored all the instructors, the older Irenes, ensuring they were sufficiently rigorous and effective in their training and discipline. Judge any disputes among the boys, any infractions of rules, any instances of insubordination, all came under his judgment. He heard cases, deliberated, and rendered verdicts. His judgment was swift and unquestionable. You would dread being brought before him, knowing that leniency was not in his vocabulary. Punisher. This was perhaps his most feared role. The paedonimus was empowered to inflict severe corporal punishment. He would not hesitate to use the whip or stick to enforce discipline, to break a boy's spirit of defiance, or to test his endurance. His beatings were legendary for their brutality. Imagine him as the ultimate authority figure, whose gaze alone could make you tremble, and whose hand was swift to punish. He would patrol the training grounds and barracks, observing every action, listening to every word. Any deviation from the Spartan ideal, any softness or complaint, would be noted and dealt with. His presence instilled a constant fear, but also a constant drive for perfection in the boys. The paedonimus also managed the overall structure of the agoge, including the communal messes and the curriculum such as it was. He was the guardian of the Spartan way of life, ensuring that each generation of boys was forged into the unyielding warriors the state required. His role demonstrates just how deeply the state penetrated every aspect of a Spartan child's life, leaving virtually no room for parental influence once the agoge began. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the immense power of the paedonimus is that ancient sources, particularly Xenophon's Constitution of the Spartans, explicitly detail the paedonimus as having supreme authority over the boys of the agoge, including the power to appoint Irenes' older boys as instructors and to inflict punishment. This historical consistency across different authors confirms his central, powerful role. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that the paedonimus was reportedly assisted by a council of elders, and even a group of mastigophoroi, literally whip-bearers, who were responsible for carrying out the floggings and ensuring obedience. Imagine a medieval school with an actual team of people whose job it is to wield whips. It emphasizes the institutionalized nature of corporal punishment. Historians still argue whether the absolute power vested in the paedonimus primarily ensured the unwavering discipline and effectiveness of the Spartan military, or if it also fostered a culture of fear and suppressed true independent thought, ultimately making Spartan society rigid and resistant to necessary adaptation. Did he create perfect soldiers, or just perfect automatons regardless? The paedonimus was the iron fist of Sparta's educational system, his presence a constant reminder that your life, your pain, and your very will belonged entirely to the state. So, the paedonimus was the iron fist shaping your physical and mental fortitude. This relentless external pressure, combined with the internal hardships, led to a profound psychological impact: emotional suppression, loyalty to state. Forget expressing your feelings or cultivating personal ambitions. Your Spartan upbringing systematically crushed individuality, fostering a detached stoicism and an unwavering, almost pathological, devotion to the collective identity of Sparta above all else. Imagine your inner world. From the moment you entered the agoge, you were taught to conceal pain, fear, and any other soft emotions. Crying was a weakness, discouraged and punished. Complaining was unacceptable. You learned to build an emotional wall, pushing down discomfort and distress, presenting an impassive face to the world. It's like being forced to wear a permanent emotional straitjacket, where any internal feeling is immediately suffocated. This emotional suppression extended to joy and sorrow, while not completely absent. Public displays of strong emotion were rare and frowned upon. Even grieving the loss of a comrade in battle was to be brief and stoic, quickly replaced by a renewed focus on duty. The ideal Spartan was unswayed by personal sentiment, a machine of duty and discipline. The goal was to create a mind that was entirely focused on the collective. Your identity as an individual was systematically eroded. You were not you. You were a Spartan. Your personal desires, your dreams, your very sense of self were subsumed by the overarching purpose of serving the state. This intense indoctrination meant that loyalty to the state became your paramount virtue, overriding family ties, personal safety, and even your own life. This psychological conditioning resulted in a deep sense of camaraderie within your agile and ultimately your military unit. But it was a bond forged in shared hardship and collective purpose, not necessarily individual affection. You were loyal to your fellow Spartans because your survival, and Sparta's, depended on it. The infamous laconic speech, which we've touched upon, was another manifestation of this psychological discipline. It trained you to be precise, unemotional, and efficient in communication, eliminating any frivolous or personal expression. Your words were tools, not vehicles for emotion. This constant psychological pressure also likely led to a rigid, inflexible mindset. Spartans were renowned for their adherence to tradition and their resistance to innovation. When faced with new challenges, their ingrained response was often to double down on their established, rigid methods, rather than adapt. This very strength in one area became a weakness in another. One mainstream historical fact that profoundly illustrates this psychological impact is the Spartan concept of the hot gates, or Thermopylae, the willingness of Spartan warriors to fight to the last man, knowing they faced certain death, is not just a testament to their physical courage, but to a deeply ingrained psychological loyalty to the state that transcended individual survival. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that Spartan mothers were famously quoted as telling their sons going to war to come back with your shield, or on it, meaning victorious, or dead. This pithy, brutal saying encapsulates the complete psychological expectation of sacrifice and duty, and the complete suppression of maternal fear for a child's life. Imagine your mom's last words before you left for deployment being a reminder that failure meant death. Historians still argue whether the extreme emotional suppression and emphasis on collective loyalty primarily contributed to Sparta's military invincibility and social cohesion, or if it also led to a brittle society that struggled with internal dissent and lacked the psychological flexibility to adapt to changing geopolitical realities. Did it make them resilient? Or just rigid regardless? Your mind as a Spartan child was a carefully constructed fortress, designed to keep emotions out and unwavering loyalty in, a chilling testament to the state's total control over your inner world. So, your mind was a fortress of unwavering loyalty, engineered through emotional suppression. But the body, even a Spartan body, still needed fuel, and that fuel was delivered with the same austerity and purpose, bringing us to food and diet course rations, limited variety. Forget gourmet meals or even satisfying portions. Your daily intake as a Spartan child was deliberately meager, designed not for pleasure or robust growth, but to accustom you to hunger, resilience, and the bare necessities of survival. Imagine your meals in the agoge. They were functional, not enjoyable. Your primary sustenance would be a famously unappetizing dish known as melis zomos, or black broth. This was a concoction of boiled pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. Its taste was notoriously bland and often described as repulsive by non-Spartans. Even the Spartans themselves sometimes joked about it. But they ate it because it provided sustenance. It's like living on a permanent, really unappetizing protein shake. But it's gray and tastes vaguely of pig, beyond the black broth. Your diet would consist of coarse barley bread, even rougher than the peasant bread we talked about in the Middle Ages. You might get some cheese, olives, and a few figs. Depending on the season and availability, vegetables would be limited, primarily hearty greens or legumes. Meat, other than the bit in the black broth, was rare, especially for younger boys. The portions were deliberately small, forcing you to experience chronic hunger. This deliberate underfeeding served several purposes. Hardening against hunger. It prepared you for military campaigns where food might be scarce, teaching you to function effectively on minimal rations, encouraging resourcefulness. As we discussed, it prompted you to steal food to supplement your diet, honing your stealth and cunning. Discouraging gluttony. The Spartans disdained excessive eating and indulgence. Seeing it as a weakness that softened the body and mind, your diet was a constant lesson in self-control and austerity. There was no emphasis on diverse nutrients or culinary pleasure. The goal was simply to provide enough calories to keep your body functioning for rigorous training, without allowing any comfort or excess. You ate because you had to, not because you wanted to. The communal dining halls, the syssitia, where men and boys ate together, further reinforced this austere diet. Everyone ate the same basic fare, fostering equality and preventing any individual from indulging more than his peers. This shared experience of simple, often unpleasant, food was another binding element of Spartan society. One mainstream historical fact that famously highlights this diet is the universal consumption of black broth, melis zomos, as the staple food for Spartan men and boys in the syssitia. Ancient accounts, notably by Plutarch and even Cicero, describe its unpleasant taste and its role as a fundamental part of the Spartan communal dining and austere lifestyle. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that when a Sybarite, a person from the Greek city of Sybaris, known for luxury, supposedly tasted Spartan black broth, he famously declared that it was no wonder Spartans were so brave, for any man would prefer death to living on such food. Imagine your local gourmet food critic passing out after tasting your daily meal. It's a humorous, yet grim, commentary on Spartan cuisine. Historians still argue whether the Spartan diet, despite its deliberate scarcity and limited variety, was nutritionally adequate to support a physically demanding lifestyle, or if it led to chronic malnutrition and stunted growth. Compensated for by their rigorous training and selective breeding, did they thrive despite it, or were they perpetually undersized? Regardless, your plate in Sparta was a stark representation of the state's values: bland, scarce, and designed to strip away any pleasure, ensuring that your body and mind were always disciplined, always hungry, and always ready for the rigors of warfare. So, your Spartan plate was a stark reminder of the state's relentless discipline, serving up coarse, bland rations designed to harden you for a life of perpetual readiness. This entire brutal childhood, from infancy to late adolescence, was simply a prelude to your definitive role, bringing us to the final, chilling reality of your transition to adulthood: lifelong military service. State control. There was no civilian life, no choosing a different path, your entire existence, from the moment you survived the initial inspection, was meticulously engineered to make you a soldier, bound to serve Sparta until old age or death. Imagine your graduation from the agoge. Around the age of 20, you would complete your formal training. This wasn't a moment of liberation, but a transition into a different, yet equally rigid, phase of state service. You became a hoplite, a full citizen soldier, ready to enter the Spartan army. Your life became a perpetual military camp. It's like finishing high school and immediately being drafted for life, with no option for college or a civilian career. Ever. From this point, you would live in the communal messes Syssitia with your fellow soldiers, dining and training together daily. Marriage was encouraged, but you would still spend most of your time in barracks, often having to sneak away to visit your wife. The focus remained entirely on military readiness and the bonds of the phalanx. Your loyalty was to your messmates, your unit, and ultimately, to Sparta. Your identity was entirely intertwined with your military role. There were no other recognized professions for a Spartan citizen. You didn't become a farmer, a craftsman, or a merchant. Those roles were filled by the helots or the perioikoi free non-citizens. Your sole purpose, your reason for being, was to be a warrior, ready to defend Sparta at any moment. This lifelong military service was not a temporary enlistment. You were expected to remain in active military service until the age of 60 or until death. Your entire adult life would be dominated by drills, exercises, and campaigns. Whether defending the Spartan territory or fighting abroad, your body, meticulously sculpted by the agoge, was now a permanent instrument of war. The state control that defined your childhood only intensified in adulthood. Your public and private life were subject to constant scrutiny. You couldn't travel abroad without permission, engage in trade, or pursue any interests that diverted from your military duties. Your individual freedom, a concept cherished in other Greek city-states, was virtually non-existent. You were a cog in the Spartan machine, perfectly designed for its singular purpose. This absolute dedication to military life made Sparta arguably the most formidable land power in ancient Greece for centuries. But it came at an immense cost to individual liberty and diversity within their society. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this lifelong service is the Spartan concept of citizen-soldier, homoioi, or equals. Every male Spartan citizen was expected to dedicate their entire adult life to military training and service, with no other occupation permitted. This was the defining characteristic of Spartan citizenship and the foundation of their society. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that even when married, Spartan men were often expected to spend more time living and dining in their communal messes with their fellow soldiers than with their own families. Supposedly to maintain their military discipline and camaraderie, imagine being married, but essentially living in a perpetual fraternity house with all your army buddies. It's a striking example of the state's prioritization of military bonds over domestic ones. Historians still argue whether this absolute, lifelong state control over its citizens primarily contributed to Sparta's unmatched military prowess and its ability to maintain a highly stable, albeit rigid, society for centuries, or if it ultimately led to a lack of innovation, demographic decline due to limited flexibility in roles and severe demands on men, and eventual stagnation that contributed to its downfall. Did it create invincibility or eventual irrelevance? Regardless, your journey as a Spartan child culminated in a life entirely consumed by the state, a perpetual soldier whose existence was simply another brutal extension of Sparta's unyielding military might. Now, let the clang of spears, the shouts of the drill sergeants, and the gnawing ache of hunger gently recede into the distant past. The harsh communal barracks dissolve, the dust of the training ground settles, and the chilling judgment of the elders softens into a fading echo. There's no more brutal discipline, no more forced silence, no more constant fear of punishment here. Just the quiet hum of your fan, the soft comfort of your bed, and the profound stillness of the night. You can release the imagined burdens of that brutal Spartan childhood, the constant deprivation, the emotional suppression, and the lifelong, unyielding duty, that demanding existence, with all its starkness and its strange, unyielding strength, belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.